Apollo had been diagnosed with bone cancer, osteosarcoma. The disease had already spread, and there was no cure. The best the doctors could do was manage his pain and keep him comfortable in his final days. The thought of losing him felt unbearable, but Keanu knew he couldn't let sadness take over. Instead, he decided to make Apollo's last moments the happiest they could be. So, he started taking long walks with Apollo, exploring new parks, forests, and beaches. He wanted Apollo to feel the wind, smell the trees, and enjoy every moment. And with each adventure, Keanu snapped a selfie, a way to capture their journey together and keep the memories alive forever. One sunny afternoon, they set off on a peaceful walk through a secluded forest. The air was crisp, Apollo wagged his tail, enjoying every step. Keanu knelt beside him, held up his phone, and clicked one last selfie. He smiled at the photo, not knowing that what he had just captured would soon send chills down his spine, and change everything forever. Later that evening, Keanu sat on his couch, Apollo curled up beside him, resting after their long walk. As he scrolled through the photos on his phone, he paused at the selfie they had taken earlier in the forest. He smiled at Apollo's goofy expression, but his eyes were soon drawn to something disturbing in the background. At first, he thought it was just a shadow from the trees, but as he zoomed in, his heart skipped a beat. There was a figure standing behind them. It was faint, almost transparent, but clearly human-shaped. It wasn't there when he took the picture, he was sure of that. His hands went cold as a chill ran down his spine. He stared at the photo, his breath shallow, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Just then, Apollo lifted his head, his ears perked up. A low growl rumbled from his throat as he turned toward the dark hallway. Keanu followed his gaze, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Apollo?" Keanu whispered, gently resting his hand on the dog's back. But Apollo wasn't paying attention to him anymore. His gaze was fixed on something unseen, his growl growing deeper. Then, out of nowhere, a loud creak came from the hallway. Keanu froze. His breath caught in his throat. The house was old, but that sound was different, like footsteps on the wooden floor. Slowly, he stood up, his eyes flicking between Apollo and the dark hallway. His mind raced. Was someone inside the house? No, that was impossible, he had locked the doors when they got back. And yet, that sound, it was real. Swallowing his fear, Keanu took a step forward. Apollo barked sharply, his body tense as if preparing to protect his owner. The sound echoed through the silence, making Keanu's stomach tighten. He turned his phone's flashlight on and aimed it down the hallway. Nothing. Just shadows. But then, another sound. This time, it wasn't a creak. It was a whisper. Faint, almost like the wind. Keanu's hands tightened around his phone. His throat went dry. His gut told him to run, to leave the house immediately. But something inside him, a deep, unexplainable feeling, told him to stay. He looked down at Apollo, who was now standing, his body rigid, his eyes still locked on the hallway. Keanu had never seen his dog like this before. Apollo was strong, brave, but this? This was fear. And then, something even stranger happened. Apollo stopped growling. Instead, he let out a soft, whimpering sound, a sound Keanu had never heard before. It wasn't fear. It was sadness. Keanu's chest tightened. He turned back to the selfie, his fingers shaking. He looked closer at the figure behind them. Something about it seemed familiar. His breath hitched. It couldn't be. Was this someone from his past? He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The eerie presence. Apollo's reaction. It was all connected. And somehow, Keanu knew. This wasn't over. Keanu's hands felt cold as he stared at the image. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew this place. He knew this presence. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the forest where he had taken the selfie with Apollo. It wasn't just any place, it was a place filled with memories, both good and painful. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the past rush in. He was just a boy the last time he had walked those same trails. Back then, the forest had been his favorite escape, a place where he and his best friend, Daniel, would spend hours playing, climbing trees, and sharing their dreams about the future. But then, one terrible day, everything changed. Daniel went missing. Keanu still remembered the panic, the endless search parties, the police interviews, and the sleepless nights that followed. The entire town had looked for Daniel, but he was never found. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Keanu had been just a kid, but he never forgot. The guilt haunted him. They had been together that day, laughing, running, playing near the lake. And then, Daniel was gone. One second he was there, and the next, nothing. For years, Keanu convinced himself that it wasn't his fault. But deep down, he had always wondered, what if he had done something differently? What if he had stayed closer? What if he had seen something that no one else had? Now, looking at the photo, his stomach twisted. The figure in the background, it looked so much like Daniel. Could it really be him? Or was his mind playing tricks? Just then, Apollo let out a soft whimper again. Keanu looked down at him, seeing the sadness in his eyes. It was as if Apollo could feel the weight of the moment too. Keanu's breath shook as he turned back to the picture. Was Daniel trying to send him a message? Had he been here all along, lost in this forest, waiting for someone to find him? His rational mind told him this was impossible. Ghosts weren't real. Spirits didn't linger in the world of the living. But deep in his heart, he felt something else. An unexplainable pull. A connection. Keanu suddenly felt the urge to go back. He needed answers. With a deep breath, he grabbed his coat, his phone still clutched in his hand. Apollo, as if sensing his decision, stood up beside him, ready. It was time to return to the forest. And this time, he wasn't leaving without the truth. Keanu tightened his jacket as he stepped into the forest once again. The night air was cold, but something inside him burned with urgency. Apollo walked beside him, his ears twitching, his nose sniffing the air as if he knew exactly where to go. The deeper they went, the more familiar everything felt. The towering trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the faint sound of the wind whispering through the branches, it all pulled him back in time. Keanu's heart pounded. He had avoided this place for so many years, but now, it felt like he was being called back. The ghostly figure in the selfie, was it really Daniel? Apollo suddenly stopped. His body tensed, his tail stiff. He let out a soft whimper, then turned his head, staring at a spot between two trees. Keanu followed his gaze, his breath catching in his throat. There, beneath the moonlight, stood a small, old wooden structure, a half-buried treehouse. His chest tightened. He knew this place. It was their secret hideout when they were kids. He and Daniel had built it together, using whatever scraps of wood they could find. It had been their favorite place, their safe place. So why had he forgotten about it? His legs felt heavy as he walked toward it. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, covered in moss and dirt. He reached out, pushing it open with a loud creak. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but something caught his eye, a small metal box sitting in the corner, half buried under old leaves. His hands shook as he picked it up. The lid was rusted, but as he wiped away the dirt, his heart nearly stopped. His name and Daniel's name were carved into it. Memories rushed back in waves. They had buried this box together. It was supposed to hold their greatest secrets, their childhood dreams, their promises to each other. Keanu swallowed hard as he pried it open. Inside, he found a few old drawings, a toy car, a letter, and something that made his fingers freeze. A small silver necklace, one that Daniel had always worn. His vision blurred. How was this still here? Why had he forgotten about it? Then, suddenly, a sound behind him. He turned sharply. Apollo was wagging his tail now, staring at something Keanu couldn't see. Keanu's breath hitched. The air felt warm, almost comforting. And then, in that silent, still moment, he felt it. A presence. Not cold. Not dark. Just, familiar. Tears stung his eyes. The figure in the photo, the strange pull to return here, it all made sense now. Daniel wasn't a threat. He was guiding him home. Keanu sat on the grass, Apollo resting beside him. The forest was quiet now, no longer eerie, no longer holding the weight of forgotten memories. The small metal box lay open in his hands, Daniel's silver necklace glinting under the soft moonlight. It all made sense now. Daniel hadn't been haunting him. He had been guiding him. Bringing him back to the place they had once shared, to the memories Keanu had locked away. The guilt he had carried for years, the feeling that he had somehow failed his friend, finally started to lift. Apollo let out a tired sigh, pressing his head gently against Keanu's leg. Keanu looked down at him, his heart aching. His loyal companion, his best friend, his protector, had led him to the truth. But deep down, Keanu knew. Apollo didn't have much time left. His illness had weakened him, and though he still tried to be strong, Keanu could see it in his tired eyes. The long walks, the happy moments, they had been as much for Apollo as they had been for Keanu. A lump formed in his throat. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, running a hand through Apollo's fur. "You helped me find my way back." Apollo's tail wagged weakly. His mission was complete. In that moment, Keanu realized something. Apollo's purpose in his life had been so much greater than just companionship. He had been there through heartbreak, loneliness, and loss. And now, even in his final days, he had given Keanu something precious, closure. Tears welled in Keanu's eyes, but he smiled. He had spent so much time worrying about losing Apollo, but now he understood something far more important: love doesn't end when life does. The bonds we share, the memories we create, they never truly fade. Keanu knew that when the time came, it would hurt. But for now, Apollo was still here. And he would cherish every second. Under the stars, with the whispers of the forest around them, Keanu held Apollo close, knowing that some goodbyes were not really the end, just a new beginning.